Welcome everybody to today's event. We are going to speak about this book, which is called Israel and the Middle East. And I'm very, very happy that we can have this distinguished guest here today from Israel, Mr. Itamar Rabinovich. You have been writing this book, and I look forward to your presentation about the book. But first, I would like to introduce you just a little bit for our audience. Itamar Rabinovich is Professor Emeritus of the Middle Eastern History at Tel Aviv University. He's also Israel's former ambassador to the United States and former chief negotiator with Syria in the mid-90s and the former president of Tel Aviv University. So welcome, thank you for coming. And we are going to have a discussion between Itamar Rabinovich and Hannes SWOBODA, who is the president of the International Institute for Peace. And he used to be also the chair of the S&D fraction in the European Parliament. So he has a very, very long tradition as a politician. And I look forward then to your comments after Mr. Rabinovich's introductory remarks, as I would say. For the procedure, I suggest that Mr. Rabinovich will first just give a little bit about a glance about what is the book about. It's a short book. You can also buy it outside. It's very neat and handy, and it also has a very nice look, if you ask me. But you put a lot of history in less than 250 pages. So I read it on the weekend, and it's a very vast, I would say, Israel and the Middle East. It's not the easiest history. You draw upon also the actual developments, but also go back to what happened before, what have been steps towards peace, also towards normalization, as you mentioned it. But I already leave it here. My name is Stephanie FENKART. I will be moderating the discussion. And afterwards, we are happy and look forward to your questions from the audience and statements. But first of all, thank you again for coming. The floor is yours. And please give us just an overview about the main challenges, topics of this book. And the microphone, I think, is over there.
Yeah. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for hosting me. Before I begin talking about the book, let me mention that tonight is the eve of Memorial Day in Israel tomorrow, where those fallen in wars are remembered by the nation. It's a very solemn day and a very sad day in the country, and in a way, sorry to be away from the country on that day, but happy to be here. Stephanie actually put her finger on a very significant point when she complimented me on putting so much history into such a short book. Actually, the original book that was published in English and in Hebrew was called Middle Eastern Maze, and it was a book in English of 110,000 words. And I was approached by the publisher here, and they told me that they were interested in translating it and publishing it in German and to be fitted into a series of books that are 30,000 words. So we compromised on 35,000 words, and the way I found to overcome the discrepancy in numbers was to take the narrative parts of the book and condense them into one chapter. So let's say if the Ehud Barak period had a chapter in the original book, Ehud Barak gets 4 pages in this book. What was not touched was mostly the 2 analytical chapters, peace and normalization, and Israel's relationship or the sub-conflict with several Arab countries. And let me say a word about that. Normally, when people speak about the Arab-Israeli conflict, people speak about a conflict. Sometimes the word Arab-Israeli conflict became so dominant in discussing and looking at Middle Eastern politics that people call it the Middle East conflict, even though there are many other conflicts in the Middle East, as we know all too well. Now, the Arab-Israeli conflict, in a way, is a somewhat misleading term because there is not one Arab-Israeli conflict. It's a series of conflicts. There is the core conflict, which is the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, or Israel and Zionism and the Palestinian national movement, and it is a classical national conflict, the way the German-French conflict was, the way the Turkish-Greek conflict is, Nagorno-Karabakh, Cyprus, conflict between two national movements, each of which claims absolutely the right and the claim for possession of the whole country or the whole piece of land. And these conflicts are very difficult to settle. Oftentimes they are not settled, they just become irrelevant or die out, like the French-German conflict that led the world or Europe to three major wars, and then at the end of World War II, they ended. I should say here in brackets that Jean Monnet, the man who conceived the idea of the European Union, conceived of it in the middle of World War II. The real vision in the middle of World War II, when France was occupied by Germany, to think, not to dream, of a new European entity that France and Germany would be the main formulators of. So this is the core conflict. But then there are a series of other conflicts, say between Israel and Egypt, Israel and Syria, Israel and Lebanon, Israel and Jordan, and each of them is different. Israel and Egypt is to some extent a geopolitical conflict between two powerful states. Egypt today is not very powerful, it's not in a good period, but at some point it wanted to dominate the Middle East, and Israel was an obstacle. So the conflict between Egypt and Israel was for a long period a geopolitical conflict. It remained a territorial conflict over the Sinai, and then when peace was made on the basis of territories for peace, that is to say, Israel withdrew from the Sinai and Egypt gave Israel peace and a security regime, and that was the end of that. This is a peace that has lasted, fortunately, from 1979 on and overcame many difficulties. Israel and Syria is a different conflict. And again, it changes. The relationship between Israel and Syria today after the fall of the Assads is one thing, and what it was earlier was another, but these are two states fighting over hegemony or influence, not in the whole Middle East, but in the Levant part of the Middle East. Israel and Lebanon is an interesting relationship. It used to be the case in the 1950s when a cliché was common in Israel to say Lebanon would be the second Arab state to make peace with Israel. Lebanon being at the time predominantly a Christian country, the assumption was that they have a lot in common with Israel, another non-Muslim country in the region, and that they are only waiting for an opportunity. They cannot be the first to do it because they are a weak country. They need someone like Egypt or Syria to be the first, and then they could be the second. Today, I can give a lecture called Why Lebanon Would Be the Last Country to Make Peace with Israel, because it is under such heavy Iranian influence, and because the dominant community in the country is no longer Christian communities, but the Shiite community, and that is an entirely different issue. And so I won't bore you at this point by going over country by country, but as you can see, what we have is not a single Arab-Israeli conflict, but a series of conflicts that all are subsumed under the term or the notion of Arab-Israeli conflict. So that is one analytical chapter. The second analytical chapter is called Peace and Normalization. And of course, when you resolve a conflict, you settle a conflict, you want to arrive at a peaceful relationship. But what do we mean by peace? Not just the absence of war. It has to be something more meaningful, more positive in the term peace. So for many years, when peace seemed impossible, from 1948-49 to the 70s, people did not really inquire into what Arab-Israeli peace would look like because it seemed so remote. But in the early 70s, it became more feasible, and people began to think of what peace could be like. An Egyptian intellectual called Muhammad Sid Ahmed wrote a very interesting book at that time called When the Guns Fall Silent, describing what peaceful relationship between Israel and Egypt could be. Later on, when a full-fledged peace process began to take place, our late President and Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Shimon Peres wrote a book called The New Middle East. And in the book, he had a vision of a peaceful Middle East, saying that the real issue is not the conflict, but the real issue are poverty and the lack of modernization, and there should be modernization that would help both Israelis and Arabs and others to live in a more advanced, more prosperous Middle East. It was not always very well received on the other side. I attended a meeting between Shimon Peres and Amru Musa, who was the Egyptian foreign minister, and Amru Musa banged the table and said, "Shimon, maybe there should be a computer on the desk of every Arab pupil, but you will not be putting it there." Because from the Egyptian perspective, Shimon Peres' idea of a new Middle East through prosperity and economic cooperation was a way for Israel to dominate the region economically due to its more advanced technology and economy. That is to say, you leave through the front door and you come back to the kitchen window. And there were other notions, the Palestinian, the Syrian, again, I won't go into too many details at this point. And there were the Israeli thinking about peace, particularly when peace suddenly became feasible. Most of them positive, but some with concern. What would Israel's place in the region be? Would the Jews of Middle Eastern origin continue to be full-fledged Israelis, or would they see themselves as part of a different Middle East? And another term was then added called normalization. When Israel signed peace with Egypt, with Anwar Sadat, he signed a full-fledged peace treaty, and it was meant to be a full-fledged peaceful relationship, except it was not, because part of the deal was that Israel would negotiate autonomy and then maybe independence with the Palestinians, and this did not happen under Menachem Begin. And Sadat's response to this was to freeze the peace at a cold peace, which means that all the major obligations that Egypt undertook were honored. The regime, the security regime in the Sinai, telephone connection, postal connections, there are embassies in Cairo and in Tel Aviv, but the spirit of peace is not there. For instance, Egypt does not allow, to date, the development of economic relations. And how is it done? For instance, you can drive by car from Tel Aviv to Cairo. You cannot drive a truck from Tel Aviv to Cairo. If you want to send goods from Tel Aviv to Cairo, take a truck, send it to the border, you unload the truck, you upload an Egyptian truck, and the whole economic logic of that transaction goes away. Another example, there were lots of Israelis who traveled to Egypt to see the antiquities and to see Cairo and so forth. Very few Egyptians go to Israel for a number of reasons. One of them is this. The Israeli embassy in Cairo is in a tall building in an upper floor for security purposes. And then in the lobby there is a desk of the Egyptian security service. And every Egyptian who goes to the Israeli embassy needs to register in the desk of the security service. Now, if you're an Egyptian who lived in Egypt, you know that the last thing you want is to appear in the books or in the registers of the security services. So you don't go to the Israeli embassy to look for a visa. You don't go to Israel. This is what we call a cold peace. So when I was a negotiator for peace with Syria, and we seemed to be on the verge of coming to an agreement, we spent a lot of time talking about normalization. I said, this need not be a copy of the cold peace with Egypt. It should be a different peace, and we identified 23 items that altogether constituted normalization. Well, peace with Syria was never signed, and that normalization was not tested. But normalization as such remains a very important term. Normalization also has a deeper meaning, because what is Zionism? I mean, the man who conceived of political Zionism was Theodor Herzl, who lived here, and he encountered anti-Semitism during the Dreyfus trial in Paris, which he covered for the Austrian press, and he came to the conclusion that the only solution to the problem of anti-Semitism would be to normalize the existence of the Jewish people, and you can only normalize the existence if you establish a country in which Jewish people would have its own country. Not all Jews must live there, but there has to be a Jewish homeland, and this would lead to a normalization of Jewish existence. So when we speak to Arabs about normalizing the relationship, there are two levels to this term. So very briefly, this is about the two analytical chapters in the book that were kept intact in the German edition. Now, what I did in the full-fledged English and Hebrew, and as of 2 weeks from now, Korean. Don't ask me why the Koreans decided to translate the book, but they did. They offer a narrative of Arab-Israeli relations from 1948. In fact, the conflict begins earlier. The conflict begins at the end of World War I, when the Balfour Declaration is issued, the British mandate is established, and the Arab nationalism also becomes a full-fledged movement, and the clash between Zionism and Arab nationalism in its Palestinian version becomes full-fledged in the 1920s. But you can also begin in 1948 with the first Arab-Israeli war, which is, we call the War of Independence, and the Palestinians and the Arabs called the Nakba, the disaster. And so I take the evolution of the relationship from 1948 on to the, of course, the 1967 war. And I'll say something about the 1967 war, the Six-Day War. A friend of mine wrote a book on that war, and he called it the Cursed Blessing. The blessing was that it finally consolidated Israel's existence, and it persuaded the Arabs that they could not defeat Israel militarily. The curse was that we became stuck with the West Bank, with the Palestinian issue on our back, and we are stuck, we and the Palestinians are stuck with that problem since 1967. So, 67, the Yom Kippur War of 1973, this begins the full-fledged peace process orchestrated by Henry Kissinger, then the first Egyptian-Israeli peace, Arab-Israeli peace treaty, the one with Egypt in 1979, second peace treaty with Jordan, and of course more recently the Abraham Accords negotiated, ironically under Donald Trump, that led to 4 other peace agreements with Arab countries. And at this point, to conclude, we are at a crossroads. On the one hand, there is a process of peacemaking and normalization. People speak about the next step should be normalizing with Saudi Arabia. That would, of course, be very meaningful, not only in Middle Eastern, but also in larger Islamic terms. And at the same time, we had the Gaza war. We still have the Gaza war, a major tragedy for both sides, and no clear solution seems right now. I'm sure that Mr. SWOBODA and I will discuss the prospects of coming out of the present predicament, but the Arab-Israeli relationship at this point is at a very complex point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rabinovich, for this very comprehensive overview about this very difficult and long history of the Israeli conflict. I would have, before I go to Hannes, one quick question, since you mentioned the Abraham Accords. As far as I remember, you also mentioned in the book that there have been different opinions within Israel, political elites, on how to deal with all these conflicts. Should it be first dealt with the Palestinian issue, or should we actually try to normalize our relationships with our neighboring neighbors, the Arab neighbors? And there have been different, I would say, traditions in this, but in the end, the Abraham Accords left out the Palestinian issue. And I think you also mentioned that this kind of normalization, pursuing the normalization with Saudi Arabia, might have led partly also to the attack of Hamas on October 7th. And this attack obviously has been super traumatic for the Israelis and for this feeling of security. But on the other hand, it led to a very destructive war, which is ongoing until today. And I think it is the longest day Israel has been fighting. And we do see, as you mentioned, a humanitarian tragedy, which we didn't see in a very, very long time. So do you think maybe that from a political point of view, that political leadership and political will is needed to touch upon the issues, normalization and addressing the Palestinian question at the same time, that this has been something which has been missing in previous, I would say, political endeavors in coming to some kind of a better, let's say, living next to each other? Or what would be your assessment on this?
Yeah. As I said earlier, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the core of the conflict. This is how it began, and this is how other Arab countries were drawn into the conflict. But over the years, several Arab countries and a large part of the Arab minority inside Israel, the people who are Israeli citizens, in a way became tired with the Palestinian question. Said, we've given the Palestinian issue so many decades. In the case of Egypt, Syria, many were killed in wars, devastated the economies. So enough is enough. And the Palestinians don't seem to keep their own house in order. So we'll move ahead. If you are in the Emirates or in other Arab Gulf country, and you look across the Gulf into Iran, I said, okay, my problems are Iran. My problem is radical jihadi Islam. We need to think about the future because oil or the carbo hydroelectric economy will come to an end at some point. We need to develop other industries. We need to think about water. We need to think about food. Israel is a natural partner in all of this. And actually, several of the Gulf countries had under-the-table relations with Israel for many years. And at some point, the leadership of the United Emirates decided that it was willing to go all the way and actually normalize and conclude diplomatic relations. And this happened under Trump, with the help and participation of his son-in-law, Mr. Jared Kushner, but basically the pushing the force were the Emirates. And this meant that, yes, they were willing, in a way, to abandon the Palestinian cause, even though they argued to the Palestinians that now that we have a relationship with Israel, we could pressure or exert pressure on your behalf. On the Israeli side, of course, the most important debate in the country is over the Palestinian issue. That the right wing would like to annex, or the extreme right wing would like to annex. The so-called, call it moderate right wing, would just like to play for time, and the term is we manage the conflict, which means we are not seeking a solution. Center, left, and left want to solve the issue, go for a two-state solution, separate from the Palestinians and move on with our lives. So Netanyahu was, as Prime Minister for a long time, was of the school of managing the conflict, not of annexation, but over the years, he overstayed his welcome, at least as I'm concerned, and he drifted more and more to the right. Now he's very much in the hands of his extreme right-wing partners. They want to annex. They were not happy with the Abraham Accords because Israel undertook not to annex. So there was also a sort of a debate, and it continued the debate among, call it people who are think more strategically about Middle Eastern politics. Is there a prospect of making peace with the Arab states without the Palestinians, and then negotiating with the Palestinians from a position of strength, or is it something that cannot wait and needs to be done right away? This is still an open debate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Hannes, I would like to ask you maybe to reflect on what you have been hearing, but maybe also to add a little bit from your perspective. You have been traveling to Israel, you have been traveling to the Palestinian territories, but also to other Arab countries in the region. From your experience, what do you see, what do you agree, what do you think has been missed, and what do you think could be an opportunity for the future? And maybe also in light of the very, very difficult situation we are facing today. It was mentioned already, the brutal war ongoing, but also the attack, which has been very traumatizing for the Israeli society, obviously also considering the long history they have been having, the experiences they were having with the Holocaust. And then maybe also reflect a little bit on the Austrian tradition, how you see then what Austria is doing and how Austria is playing any role, or the European Union, if it could at all, in this region. So a lot of questions, but please feel free to tackle what you want.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rabinovich, to have come here and for the book, which is quite interested in some advantage if it's a short book, because more people will read it, who are not normally used to read longer books. Also, of course, there are other interesting elements in it. I will start with the second part, because my background, of course, is somebody who has been growing up in that time, is Bruno Kreisky's policies and actions and activities concerning the Middle East. At that time, very much from Israel's side, of course, if I say Israel, it's not unified, but very strong has been criticizing how can, especially a Jew, do that kind of animosity against, or express that kind of animosity against Israel. We should not forget that many people criticize, many people in Israel, not only in Israel, criticized Bruno Kreisky for the recognition of the Palestinians, of receiving Arafat, and many other issues. Still, I think it would be good if Austria today would have an active policy concerning Israel and Palestine. It has perhaps an active policy which is very one-sided, very emotional, and in some way very much connected to Netanyahu on the right side, especially with Mr. Kurz. It was not so much an Israel policy or Middle East policy, it was a support of Netanyahu's policies. And of course, also the interest to bring the FPÖ closer to the Israel side, because it was a coalition with the FPÖ, and to whitewash FPÖ as a xenophobic, very often anti-Semitic party. So this, I think, is still missing in Austria, knowing that, of course, any kind of foreign policy, especially for a small country, has to be done in some way in coordination with the European Union. Now, when I joined the European Parliament in 1996, I was vice president of the Socialist Group and Foreign Affairs spokesman, and then began the travels to Israel and to the Palestinian territories. Here, the argument against us very often has been different. Not that as Jews, as far as I know, I'm not a Jew, we shouldn't be critical of Israel, but we coming from a continent who is still very much affected by anti-Semitism. Very often our vis-a-vis on the Israeli side more openly or more, let's say, hidden, explained, well, the Europeans cannot be taken for serious because of their past, which is horrible, of course, and a past which is still visible and you can still feel in Europe. And that, of course, was one of the limitations. The second limitation, very strongly also on the side of the Palestinians said, nice that you have solidarity with us, nice that you criticize sometimes Israel, but we need the US. Without the US, you don't have anything really to play. And that was, of course, a big constraint, and that's very often forgotten. Very often people say, blue-eyed, yes, Europe should do more. But in many respects, and the Middle East especially is one sector where there was a big demand, do it together with the US. Then you can be effective. Not only from the Israeli side, not so much even from the Israeli side, but even from the Palestinian side. Because the Palestinians said, okay, if the US is on your side or is doing something, then they will put some pressure on Israel, a pressure Europe could not or was rejected by many Israeli governments to do it. And that prevented very much a stronger European action. At least that was my feeling and my impression by many visits and many talks with the Israeli foreign minister and many other, and with Arafat and many other Palestinians. Now, the question is, and that was very interesting, the question put to you, what was the concept of peace on the different sides? Because you mentioned already that the concept was moving, and of course it was moving in the direction of giving more leverage to the Israeli side, also because the Palestinian side failed to have or accept some of the compromises. Now, was it right from their perspective or wrong? I wouldn't say. It was maybe, still remember when Arafat went around and there was, I think, the Barak agreement, especially Barak, and I met Barak at one of the conference of the Socialist International, and I said, how are you? And he said, horror, disaster, because Arafat spoiled now and prevented a peace solution. Because he was, and that probably is true, Arafat was not courageous enough to say to his fellow citizens or Palestinians, look, either we come to a compromise now and accept the proposal, or the war will go on. And very often peace or other elements of positive developments are failing because we don't have courageous people to go for a solution or a compromise. This is at least my impression. Now, on the other side, of course, the concept of what could be peace was not very clear to me. I still remember when Shimon Peres, who I liked very much, and I think one of the greatest statesmen, came to the European Parliament, and we sat in the restaurant, and he took a napkin, and he drew his famous bridge he wanted to have between the Gaza area and the West Bank, in order not that there can be a united or a common one state, but not as one area, but two areas, and they could be connected with a bridge going over Israel territory, not to have any permanent conflicts between the Palestinians and the Israeli. I thought, yeah, I understand his vision or his idea, but it's not very realistic. And that, I think, very often the good meaning and the well-meaning politicians on the Israeli side had very often ideas who, of course, were not really accepted on the Israeli side, especially, of course, the right wing, and not accepted on the other hand, very often on the Palestinian side. So you mentioned also the Arab states. My impression was more and more, and I said it also to Palestinians, you always refer to the Arab states. They have their own interest. And that was it. The Arab states were not interested their prime interest was not to solve the Palestinian issue. The primary interest was very often to keep them away from their own country, especially after the experience you had in Jordan, the experience you had, of course, also in Lebanon. And this was also one element of the whole disaster in Lebanon, not only that it became a stronghold of the Shiite extremists, but the whole question of Palestinian and Sharon's activities and so on in the refugee camps. But the Palestinian, my feeling was the Palestinian Authority didn't want, or the leadership didn't want to recognize that they cannot count on the other Arab countries to defend their interest and to go perhaps to another war. They had wars, whatever the reason was, but they were not interested to go another war. And you see it also now with the Hamas disaster, because finally they left alone even more or less by Iran. I don't know what your experience or your idea is, if they expected that Iran would go into a war, but it was clear, even Iran, who is the most staunchest enemy of Israel, is not going into war for Hamas. And this was always I think the wrong fantasy, illusion of Palestinian leadership that they can count on the solidarity of the Arab countries. If the Arab countries had some solidarity, it was because of their own population, who was emotionally in favor of the Palestinians, and they wanted, of course, to show to their own population, yes, we are on the Palestinian side, but they didn't really act. The last point maybe, was there any possibility to prevent what happened now in Gaza? And I don't mean the immediate, let's say, security leaks and deficiencies of security forces. When the Gaza voted and elected their leadership and elected Hamas representatives. Hamas at that time also nominated some sort of ministers, or however you would call it, who were not really extreme Hamas politicians, but were some experts on health issue, on economic issue, and others. At that time, Israel, and of course with American support and mostly of the European support, said no contact with these kind of leaders who have been elected by the people in Gaza. We from the parliament met some of these people. And irrespective of that kind of sanctions, so to say, I don't know if it would have helped, but I think it was a big mistake if there are people elected to say they are elected, but we don't recognize the election. Because that gave Hamas, of course, some sort of new legitimacy, another kind of legitimacy, not the one of the international, but by showing to its own people, look, they speak about democracy, they say only Israel is a democracy, there is no election, now there are elections, and we elected our people, and it's not recognized. I think at that time one should have tried to have some reasonable, relatively reasonable, of course, people, moderate people, let's say so, from the Hamas who have been elected, have been appointed as local ministers, and try to have some dialogue, some activities. Anyway, Israeli government had contacts to Hamas and had even, some of them even promoted Hamas in order to have a counterforce against the Palestinian Authority. But I think that was a mistake because this radicalized the Hamas leadership, and that led also to that kind of cruel and unbelievable massacre which happened on 7th of October. So my conclusion is there was no clear vision on the Israeli, mostly on the vision on the Israeli side, what peace could be. There was no strong willingness on Arab states really to put pressure on the one hand on Israel or to propose something, and the Arab peace plan came very, very late, very late. The recognition of Israel should have started much earlier, but Also, they were not very courageous. They just wanted to have, didn't want to annoy their own population. And I think there were big mistakes of the leadership of the Palestinians, that they were not ready for them to see the reality that the big player, the US, did not really act to help them to form their own state, that the European Union was too weak and was also dependent on the US, that the Arab neighbors were not very helpful either, to put too much pressure because they had their own agenda. And as we see it also today, there's always their own agenda. So that was the situation. And I fear, but this is the last point about the future, that Israel, as I think was also mentioned today in the media, is working on step by step on the realization of this crazy Trump plan about the Riviera and pushing more or less in the long term, not from one day to another, Palestinians out of the Gaza area or concentrate them on a very small piece of land where they move in time to other areas. And I don't see a real perspective of peace, but maybe Mr. Rabinovich has a perspective and we'll come into the debate now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So you raised many, many points, and I'm not sure I will respond immediately to all of them, but to some of them. First, there was a mood in the Arab world that several of the Arab states abandoned, but many of the Palestinians still keep, said, ultimately time is on our side. There are 320 million Arabs. There are 7.5 million Jews in Israel. Israel is 20% of the population is Arab anyway. And given birth rates and so forth, then as one prominent Palestinian intellectual said to me, there's nothing wrong with our genes. In time, we'll catch up, and numbers will talk. So why make the concession? We can wait. And there is also a view that is sometimes common in the Arab world that says, well, you know, if you look back in history, yes, there was an Arab empire, it then declined, then the Crusaders came and left, and the Persians came and left, and the Turks came and left, and the Westerners came and left. The Zionists came and have not left yet, but at some point they will leave. We have time. History is on our side. So if history is on our side, we don't need to compromise. It's a mood. And you mentioned the fact that there were two occasions in which I say far-reaching proposals were made by Israeli leaders to the Palestinian leaders that were rejected or not accepted. One was Ehud Barak to Yasser Arafat in Camp David in 2000, and the other was by Ehud Olmert to Abu Mazen in 2008. I call them far-reaching, I don't call them generous, because it's generous is, of course, the wrong term to use, but far-reaching. Let's say Ehud Olmert, who made the most far-reaching statement, said about Israel should keep 6% of the West Bank to accommodate the settlements, only 6%, and would offer the Palestinians a swap of 6% in the south of the country, actually contiguous to the Gaza Strip, so that the area of the Gaza Strip could be expanded, and a very detailed offer. And Condoleezza Rice, the American Secretary of State, in her memoirs, wrote, twice I couldn't believe my eyes or ears. Once when I saw what Olmert offered, and the second was when I realized that Abu Mazen did not respond. Why he did not respond, difficult to know. Olmert was at the end of his term. There were people who whispered to him that don't make a deal with Olmert because he's he's on his way out, wait for the new government. I think that ultimately Abu Mazen is a refugee from Safad, and of course what any Israeli government, when making that agreement with the Palestinians, will insist on is that the Palestinians abandon the demand of what is known as the right of return. And Abu Mazen, personally, as a refugee from Safad, cannot sign this concession. I would say, to use some perspective, we speak about refugees. The issue of the Palestinian refugees was created in 1948. In the late 1940s, between the Germans who had to leave Czechoslovakia and Poland, and the Indians and the Pakistanis who had to move from one part to the other, dozens of millions became refugees. The Jews from Arab countries became refugees. None of them remained a refugee. The only place where the refugees remained a refugee for so long is this issue. For many years, it was a policy of the Arab world to keep the issue alive, and I think that if and when we reach the point of making a final deal, the issue of eliminating the refugee problem as a problem needs to be of prime importance. In any way, this was, in a way, the last opportunity, the Olmert offer. He didn't reject it, he did not respond to it. Abu Mazen, that's a pity, but there were many points of pity in this painful history. I want to speak at some length about the point you raised about what Hamas was hoping to accomplish when it staged the terrorist attack of October 7. First of all, what is Hamas? Hamas is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Egyptian, call it fundamentalist party. And it is a fanatical fundamentalist party. It has more radical members and less radical members, but it is a fundamentalist radical party, and all you need to do is read their charter. In their charter, Israel could never be recognized because, according to Islamic law, or Islamic values, a country that was Muslim and came under foreign hands, Christian, or in this case Jewish, it has to be redeemed, it has to be back. So, of course, in the case of Andalus in Spain, it's not realistic, but in the case of Palestine, it's more realistic. And in the Hamas charter, said you cannot recognize Jewish sovereignty in Palestine. You cannot recognize Jewish sovereignty. You cannot make peace. So at some points in time, the more pragmatic elements in Hamas said that they are willing to sign not peace, but a long-term armistice called in Arabic Hudna. It says, we don't recognize the state of Israel, you don't have to recognize us, but we decide on sort of long-term armistice. It never materialized. Now, what has happened with Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas in the last 20-odd years? So, Hamas, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, came to power with genuine hatred of Israel. It's partly because Israel was friendly with the previous regime of the Shah, and secondly because it's the point of view of a radical branch of Shiism, which is represented in the regime. And they were planning to fight Israel and to destroy it at some point. Now, the Iranians realized that they could not overcome Israel's technological superiority. In the 1980s, a term was coined called RMA, the Revolution in Military Affairs, that to say some armies, the American, the Russian, the British, French, the Israeli, underwent a technological revolution. And Iran and its proxies realized that they could not hope to defeat Israel in ordinary battle. They developed what we call the ORMA, the Other Revolutionary Military Affairs. Said, we cannot hope to defeat you in a normal battle, but we have other things to do. We can go underground, we can immerse ourselves in the civilian population, we can go for a long war of attrition that a democratic country and a normal economy cannot hold on. And they developed this concept, which in the first years of this century was given further impetus by the introduction of precise weapons. The whole nature of warfare has been altered by the fact that today anyone can build and fly a drone, for 2,000-3,000 miles and hit a target at that distance. It could be a mountain chief in Yemen, or it could be a Ukrainian peasant fighting the Russians. So the whole nature has been altered. And of course there are the rockets and ballistic missiles, which again can hit targets at great precision from a long distance. Iran is a very sophisticated country. It was very good at building its own rockets, missiles, and drones. It is now at the point at which it is providing Russia with drones to fight in Ukraine. And they began to come to the conclusion that they could possibly defeat Israel. So what happened in 1967, that the Arab realization that Israel could not be defeated in battle was beginning to change around 2010 and came to maturity around 2020, when we know from good evidence that the Iranians and Hezbollah came to the conclusion that Israel could be defeated by launching war on Israel from several fronts. That is to say, Hamas from Gaza, Hezbollah from Lebanon, Syria, the Iraqi militias, and the Houthis. Five fronts, and of course try to foment an uprising in the West Bank, an uprising among Israeli Arabs. That was the strategic thinking. Hamas had its own view. Hamas is not exactly, was not exactly an Iranian proxy, because Iran is a Shiite country and Hamas is very much a Sunni movement. And Hamas was taken over by Yahya Sinwar, who was released from Israeli prison, came back to Gaza and took over the Gaza Strip in 2014, and he began to prepare for war. He came to the conclusion that he could build an army of 40,000 and conquer large parts of southern Israel with a surprise attack. Lo and behold, who helped him accomplish that? The Netanyahu government, because it arranged for the Qataris to provide Hamas and the Gaza Strip with money, presumably for humanitarian purposes, but you have to be very naive to believe that money from Qatar to the Gaza Strip would end up in hospitals and schools and not in building tunnels and rockets. And he decided on his own, not in coordination with Iran, to attack on October 7. Hezbollah did not fully join in. They only went for a war of attrition in the north, and Iran originally did not join in. So it was a costly miscalculation on the part of Yahya Sinwar. Let me stop here.
Thank you. I would have a couple of questions, but I would first go into the audience and ask if you have some comments, questions. Please raise your hand. My colleague is somewhere here, I hope. Jared? Okay, and does anyone have a question or some comments? Yeah, there, Ralph, first one.
I have a quick question.
Maybe you can introduce yourself very briefly.
My name is Ralf Janik. I'm a researcher at Sigmund Freud Private University of Vienna, and I'm part of the academic board of IIP. My question concerns the relationship between justice and peace. The reason why I'm asking is that years ago I visited this museum with huge quotation marks in Melita. It's called a terrorist Disneyland that they dedicated to all their alleged successes during the 2006 Lebanon war. Hezbollah, it's a Hezbollah museum, but basically it's a propaganda museum. And the tour guide, who was obviously also a Hezbollah member, said that justice is better than peace. So there can't be peace if there is no justice. And for me, that somewhat this short phrase encapsulated the whole story, why there can't be peace if both sides, and in particular, the one side that feels that it's the weaker one, the historically wronged one, emphasizes and says, yeah, without justice there can't be peace. Because from an Austrian perspective, the reason why we have peace is that at times we said peace is better than justice. So how do you make you yourself, your own country, but also your adversaries, how do you get to the point where you say, actually, okay, so South Tyrol is no longer Austria, so what? But we have peace with Italy. How do you get to that point? I don't know, maybe you know, but I guess not either. It's a big question, it's a lot of expectation from you.
There is a book by an American intellectual called Eric Hoffer, The Mind of a Fanatic. There are many other studies, what makes a person a fanatic. Now, Hezbollah, this is the Shia in Lebanon had a close relationship with the Shiite centers. The large Shiite centers are in Iraq and in Iran. The people from South Lebanon went to study, came back to Lebanon, where it goes back to the days of the Shah in Iran, did not begin with the regime of the Ayatollahs. And they, in a way, have been brainwashed. I mean, the people who are members of Hezbollah are brainwashed. And they're totally subservient to the Iranian regime. They're a real proxy. And I don't think you can look for a good rational explanation as to why they do this and do that. And, Hezbollah introduced into the equation the notion of suicide bombing. If you remember, in 1983, after the 82 war in Lebanon, both the Americans and the French were expelled from Lebanon by suicide bombers. So the idea, if you have an individual who is willing to kill himself, or in some cases herself, for a cause, this is something that is very difficult to stop or comprehend. But it happens, and it's part of the picture, and it's unfortunately Hezbollah's contribution to the international scene.
As far as I understand you, it's not only on the Hezbollah side, but it's also on the Israeli side. I would say on the Israeli side, what kind of justice? Because also on the Israeli side, I see, without comparing and putting on the same level, that also their justice, especially if justice is combined with religious factors or extreme religious factors, it is just for us to get this land where there are Arabs, because justice, or the idea to have a holy land is more important than peace. So I see it, again, not on the same level, but I see a similar situation also on the Israeli side. And in general, I would say you cannot have peace if there is not a minimum of justice included into the peace. And this is the same situation as we will have now in Ukraine. Can there be peace if there is not a minimum of justice, which does not mean to withdraw or to go back to the past, because I fully agree what you said about the refugees. I always said it is absolutely crazy to think that all the refugees could return. If you put this condition as a condition for peace, you will never have peace. But to this question, maybe you can say something how you see it on the Israeli side.
The radical right wing in Israel, our Minister of Finance, Mr. Smotrich, is also a religious man. and this is religiously motivated. This is the Holy Land, our Holy Land. It's been promised to us, it's been given to us, and therefore it should be ours. And if other people want to live here, they can live, but not as full-fledged citizens. Mr. Smotrich published in 2017 a paper, you can find it on the internet. It's called Bezalel Smotrich's Decision Plan. It's about 7 or 8 pages in which he outlines his program. He said Israel should annex the West Bank because it's ours, and the Palestinians who live in the West Bank can remain as residents, not as citizens, and those who want to leave can leave, and those who want to resist will be resisted and punished. And he's very proud of it. He gives it to foreign visitors, and that's my vision. You know, I and many other Israelis have nothing in common with this, but we look puzzled at the fact, and one of the reasons that we are critical of Netanyahu is it took this man who is barely crossed the bar to get into the parliament, and gave him 2 very important ministries, and together with another character, Mr. Ben-Gvir. I won't mention his first name because it's also my first. Itamar Ben-Gvir, he's a convicted felon. He's now Netanyahu made him the Minister of National Defense. So I think that this government is at the end of its rope, and it may take a little more time or more time, but there will be a return to a more centrist government. And a centrist government will not overturn everything that this government did. This is something, you know, we look very closely in Israel at Hungary and at Poland, where you had 2 democratic countries taken over by right-wing populist parties. So in Hungary, Orban is still very much in power. In Poland, we had a change, but they could not reverse everything that was done by that government. So I don't expect, even when we have a change of government, which I hope we do, an immediate return to normal and full reversal. The damages are going to be long-lasting.
Yes, we have a question there in the back.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Rabinovich. I have a question about the ideas and fantasies of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and Trump with Riviera. How much do you think does this endanger the premises of the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty? Because there was also something about Gaza. And the second question that I would have very short is, do you think that there are peace initiatives or actions on the second level of the Palestinian administration where the technocrats are sitting, like the government, not Abbas, but beneath?
Thank you, Doron. Yes, I think the ideas of annexation pushed by Smotrich are very dangerous on a number of counts. One is that they will turn Israel into Palestine into one state, and one state will not be a Jewish state. For someone like myself who wants to live in a Jewish democratic state, this is a nightmare. But it's also dangerous because it could lead to the end of the peaceful relationship with Egypt, with Jordan, and to the signatories of the Abraham Accords. The act of annexation could be the one step too many. Now, of course, in the United States, we live in a very strange time in which one person, call him very unorthodox, to put it gently, forces his will on the world's greatest power, and in a way on the world. I think there will be a pushback inside the United States and in other parts of the world, but at this point there's very little resistance. And what matters is what one man and a small group of advisors or even sycophants who tell him what he wants to hear becomes the policy. It's not a stable, durable policy. I think the idea of cleansing the Gaza Strip and turning it to a Riviera with a Trump hotel sort of struck him in the middle of the press conference, and he just said it, and he then forgot it and then came back to it. It's not something that is the result of a policy process. I mean, the American government can be a very orderly government. There is a policy planning staff in the State Department. There is the National Security Council. They know how to prepare policy papers with alternatives and everything that goes with it. But at this point, they don't matter.
Another question? Okay, I don't see. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Gregor Reidl. I have a question regarding the position of the European Union and the European Union member states. The EU has been funding the Palestinians for quite some time, also in Gaza, actually intended for hospitals and schools, but everyone would have suspicions that it was also used for tunnels and rockets. Also, the EU has, until now, is still supporting the most corrupt international organization, which is UNRWA, which is at the core also of this cult of refugees, and is actually continuing and prolongating the right of return and the problems with it. Should the EU take a different position? Can the EU do something different in the future now that we've seen the results of the EU policy towards the Palestinian issue?
As I indicated earlier, I think that when we come to a settlement and try to comprehensive settlement, we should put an end to the whole notion of refugees, so that you have to end the situation of refugees. People should be maybe given reparations. People should have to be settled, but the notion of refugees 70 years after the event, more than 70 years after the event, is not acceptable. So, but I don't think it would be wise to do it right now when the conflict is still raging. I think we need to come to the point where we can settle the conflict, and in that context, put an end to UNRWA and to the whole notion of refugees in the Middle East. And by the way, say refugees in the Middle East, there's actually more Syrian refugees than Palestinian refugees. But that, I mean, it is of interest in Europe, where, of course, Angela Merkel got into trouble by admitting 1 million Syrian refugees. But in the Middle East, the whole idea of Syrian refugees is of no importance.
Yeah, Hannes, I would like to, maybe you can also reflect.
It was not
on
only a
opinion.
question, it was a statement. It was a statement which is at least partly wrong. What is the situation? What was the situation? The situation was that, of course, the European Union spent a lot of money, difficult to control, because we have no people on the spot to control what is spent everything. I think much has been spent in the right way, but I definitely will not deny that probably something has been spent also by UNRWA, perhaps not in the right way, because it's easy, even in Europe, it's very difficult to control every money which is spent in one or the other place, and it's especially difficult there. There has been always a contradictory position of Israel. Israel said, please spend, because we don't want to that people, perish, and we don't want to pay it, so do it. It was a bit similar to the situation between Qatar, Israel and Qatar. So we were asked to spend the money, and then came the criticism, without us being able to control it. When there was a criticism, justified or not, we did. I remember very well, for example, one element was the school books in Gaza or in Palestinian territories, which definitely included anti-Semitic elements in it. As far as we could at that time, I don't know what happened afterwards, the school books were changed. If it came back again or whatever, I cannot say. But we had a separate committee in the European Parliament where we discussed the issue, where we have been looking at the school books, etc. So when there were accusations, we tried to change as fast as possible. But I don't say that in a foreign territory, which is not a recognized state, which is another international organization, it is not possible to control. But I definitely reject the idea that everything was corrupt or was going into the weapons. That part have been sidelined. I would not deny that this can happen, especially in that chaotic situation. Which again leads me back to the situation one should have had at the big, even including Gaza, a new situation. I remember very well when we discussed with, I think it was Dov Weinglass, the advisor of Sharon, at the time when Israel left unilaterally the Gaza area. And we said, don't do it unilaterally. You have to have a structure there. Just to leave is not a good situation. And I remember very well that there were many Israeli experts also who said at that time, don't do that unilateral. Just leave and then the chaos will stay there. It should have been done in some sort of an agreement and some sort of building up a different structure. So that was the big mistake. And of course you can say, don't spend any money, do it as unfortunately, the Israeli government does it now. It's creating a lot of disasters, hunger, despair, death, destruction. But this is not the way out. The way out is to find a solution also in difficult and chaotic situations. But again, I think the unilateral withdrawal, look, unilateral withdrawal, what has happened now, they come back because of the terrorist attack, of course. But it was, you could, if you do some analysis of situation, it was clear that what will happen in Gaza will not be a peaceful development if you just leave and still control, of course, the entrance. It was not, you don't leave a country which is sufficient, there is a structure, there is a government, there are open borders. No, you leave a country or an area, but still control it from the outside. And legally, when they are the legal experts, legally Israel was still responsible for the area because the fact it was occupied, not with troops inside, but with troops around the border.
Yes, I think we're coming to an end, but I do have maybe one last question. This is a peace institute, and I do think it was mentioned by Hannes at one time, we were looking for something like a political solution, because we do know from history that if you don't come to political solutions, conflicts tend to escalate one way or another. This what I think is very important, what we are lacking a lot, especially now in the conflict and the actual situation in Israel and in Gaza, is an absolute lack of empathy towards one of the other sides. So I do think it is very important that we do have empathy with what happened to the Israelis. I mean, the hostages, we didn't mention them today, and I think it is very important to mention them. We cannot even imagine how that must be for the people still in captivity. But on the other hand, we do see a bombing campaign which has been unprecedented since the Second World War. And we do see unbearable pictures coming outside from Gaza, humanitarian crisis. So I think this kind of empathy is very important for people looking for peace and also for other organizations to kind of bring this together. I do think it's not ambivalent to say that we do absolutely reject what Hamas did on the one hand on 7th of October, but on the other hand also say this brutal war at one point needs to stop for the sake of people living there. So my last and final question would be for you. What is your hope maybe for Israel in the next coming years, maybe 5 to 10 years for Israel, Israel and Palestine, but maybe also Israel and the Middle East? So maybe a positive outlook. It's a hope question.
Okay. So for Israel, I'd like to see a change of government in the next elections. I'd like to see there was a need. We had in the middle of the Netanyahu years, we had a year and a half of the Bennett Lapid government. It was a good government, and included an Arab party in the coalition. So the Israeli Arabs are about 20%. They maybe would have chosen to live in an Arab country, but they know that they live in Israel, and they see themselves, 70% of the Israeli Arabs see themselves as Israelis and would like to integrate more and more. They are moving also from their towns and villages more and more to places like Haifa and Tel Aviv. And the integration should continue into the political arena, and a political alliance between the center-left and the Arab parties would give this, would be a counterweight to the right wing. So this could maybe begin in 26 with the next election, and would continue into the end of the decade that you mentioned. With regard to Gaza, it should put an end to the war and basically do what President Biden offered several months ago. Say, if you want to end the Hamas control of Gaza, you simply have to bring somebody else. As long as they are there, they are there. You can bring somebody else would include troops from maybe Gulf countries, maybe some Europeans or Americans, but must include troops from the Palestinian Authority. And ultimately, the original notion of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip together constituting a Palestinian state, either with the bridges you mentioned or with a tunnel, but connected, that should happen. When that happens, Saudi Arabia, or even before that, Saudi Arabia will normalize with Israel. The larger Arab-Israeli conflict would more or less come to an end. But we're not, they are not going, we should not delude ourselves that we will live in paradise, because the Middle East will continue to be an unstable place because it's underdeveloped. There are abnormalities, incredible wealth in the Gulf, in some very small states, and then very poor countries like Egypt with more than 100 million, or the North African countries. Position of women is still inferior to that of men. So there are countries with ambitions, Turkey and Iran, who want to dominate the region. Russia wants to come back. I don't expect an idyllic existence in the Middle East in the next decade, but we can hope for a better existence than we have now.
Thank you so much. I think that was actually a perfect final word. And I remember, I think it was Viktor Frankl saying that you need to have like a vision, which might not be realistic, but if you have the vision at the horizon, you might reach not the top of it, but maybe just below of it, and that could be something which is at one point tangible. Thank you so much, Itamar. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much, Hannes. Thanks to you for joining. I know it's a difficult question, talking about Israel in the Middle East. It's, as I said, 230 pages. You can buy it outside. If you want to dive deeper into the topic, it was mentioned there is even a longer version out of it, so you can also get this, I hope, online, and maybe Itamar will let you know.
If you read Korean.
Or if you read Korean, you can buy the Korean version, so options are there. So thank you so much again, Itamar. Thank you, Hannes, and please stay with us for a couple of more minutes. There is some water outside and maybe also a glass of wine, and yeah, thank you. Have a nice evening.